There is a fountain that never runs dry, forever flows with the water of life. You never stop moving, you never stop moving. Where your river runs, everything lives. Where your river goes, you never thirst again. You never stop moving, you never stop moving. Your mercy flows like a wild, wild river. Your love is strong like the raging sea. God, all your goodness goes beyond all measure. Your praise like a flood pouring out of me. You call me out to walk with you on the sea. Even in my doubt, deep calls too deep. You never stop moving, you never stop moving. Your mercy flows like a wild, wild river. Your love is strong like the raging sea. God, all your goodness goes beyond all measure. Your praise like a flood pouring out of me. With your grace a limitless ocean, I'm swept away in the tide. We draw from the well of your goodness, drink from the water of life. Your grace a limitless ocean, I'm swept away in the tide. We draw from the well of your goodness, drink from the water of life. Your grace a limitless ocean, I'm swept away in the tide. Draw from the well of your goodness, drink from your water. Your mercy flows like a wild, wild river. Your love is strong like the raging sea. God, all your goodness goes beyond all measure. Your praise like a flood pouring out of me. Your mercy flows like a wild, wild river. Your love is strong like the raging sea. Out of me, your praise like a flood pouring out of me. God of creation, there at the start, for the beginning of time. No point of reference, you spoke to the dark, cast out the wonder of light. And as you speak, 100 billion galaxies are born. The vapor of your breath, the planets born. The stars are making to worship, so will I. Can see your heart in everything you made. Every burning star, a signal fire of grace. creation sings your praises, so will I. So will I. God of your promise, don't speak in vain, syllable empty, O Lord. Once you have spoken, let nature inside follow the sound of your voice. And as you speak, 100 billion creatures catch your breath, falling in pursuit of what you said. If it all reveals nature, so will I can see your heart in everything you say. Every painted sky, a canvas of your grace. If creation still obeys you, so will I. So will I. So will I. If the stars are made to worship, so will I. If the oceans are your greatness, so will I. For if everything exists to lift you high, so will I. If the wind goes where you send it, so will I. If the rocks cry out in silence, so will I. If the sum of all our praise is still falls high, you must sing again 100 billion times. Oh, 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 of salvation, chase down my heart through all of my failure and pride. On a hill you created, light of the world, abandoned in darkness deep and dry. And as you speak, 100 billion failures disappear. Where you lost your life so I could find it here. You left the grave behind everything you've done. Every part designed in a work of art called love. You gladly chose surrender, so will I. Make a different way. Every precious one you tried dying to save. You gave your life to love them, so will I. Like you would again 100 times. But the measure could amount to your desire. The one who never so much for being here this morning, for singing with us. And we want to pause before we move forward in the service this morning. And we're going to be talking a little bit about liberation today and what that means to us here in this community, and maybe how that might change us. And one of the things that we believe deeply that is a part of this conversation about liberation is acknowledging the dignity and the divinity in each and every person that we come in contact with. And so part of what we want to do to be able to get to that point this morning is just to take a deep breath and be present here in the space today. And so I don't know what your week has been like. I don't know what this morning has been like. I know that you all lost an hour of sleep. So there's that. I told the first service I was really proud of them for making it here to first service. I'm also proud of you because we all lost that hour of sleep. But thank you for being here. And so typically, one of the ways that we kind of connect more than just kind of this from the rows looking up at the stage, one of the ways that we connect is that we turn and face each other and shake hands and all that stuff. Well, there is a virus going around right now that's named after a beer, and we don't want to give it to anyone or possibly give it to anyone. And then there's just the general flu. So we're going to forego shaking hands and all that fun stuff. But I do want us to practice looking around, smiling, if you feel like it. David suggested that maybe you want to give somebody a wink, whatever you want to do. But this practice is us turning, looking, and acknowledging the people around us. And noticing that when we think intentionally about seeing the dignity and divinity in the people around us, it changes who we are. So let's do that now, and then we'll continue singing together. Blessed are the ones who do not bury all the broken pieces of their heart. Blessed are the tears of all the weary, pouring like a sky of falling, brave enough to show the Lord their scars. Blessed are the hurts that are not hidden, open to the healing touch of God. The kingdom is yours. The kingdom is yours. Hold on a little more. This is not hope is in the Lord. Keep your eyes on Him. Blessed are the ones who walk in kindness, even in the face of great abuse. Blessed are the deeds that go unnoticed, serving with unguarded gratitude. Blessed are the ones who fight for justice, longing for the coming day of peace. Blessed is the soul that thirsts for righteousness, welcoming the last, the lost, the least. The King Hope is in the Lord. Keep your eyes on Him. Blessed are the ones who suffer violence, still have strength to love their enemies. And blessed is the faith of those who persevere. Though they fall, the nail will know defeat. The kingdom is yours. The kingdom is yours. Hold on a little more. This is not the end. Hope is in the Lord. Keep your eyes on Him. The kingdom is yours. The kingdom is yours. Hold on a little more. This is not the end. Hope is in the Lord. Keep your eyes on Him. Our hope is in the Lord. The kingdom is yours. The kingdom is yours. Hold on a little more. This is not the end. Our hope is in the Lord. Keep your eyes on a little more. This is not the end. Our hope is in the Lord. Keep your eyes on Him. God, this morning as we come together, we sit together, we take breath together. God, I pray that we would be reminded that in the midst of our uniqueness and the things that make us different, God, we see your kingdom here in our differences. God, we see you in the face of the other, the person who is not like us, and we rejoice in it. We thank you for it. God, we love you. We sit in this space of love. We pray all of this in your name. Amen.
Morning. Awesome. Seems we have our missing first service people here with us now as well. That time change will really get you. Well, my name is David Roberts, one of the pastors here. Well, really one thing, and that is, surprise, surprise, it's Preface. The thing that you hear about every week because it really is one of the most important things that we do here at Watershed. If you are unfamiliar with what Preface is, perhaps you're new, well then listen up. Preface is for you, not just for you, but maybe especially for you. Something bad was happening when I was going over there. I'll stay over here. Anyway, Preface, it is a 6-week dialogue-driven, almost sort of like an on-ramping conversational class sort of experience, wherein one of our co-pastors, Matt O'Neill or Scott Hofert, kind of leads a conversation about the spiritual story and kind of history of Watershed. It gives you an opportunity to share your story, hear the story of others, and see hopefully where those stories might begin to intersect. There is literally no excuse for not going through Preface because it is completely free, and we also offer free childcare. which doesn't really happen a lot these days. So even if like your sole motivation is to let someone else watch your kids for an hour and a half on Tuesdays, I would highly encourage you to sign up for Preface, because it'll end up benefiting you in unexpected ways even beyond that. So we have had 2 full Preface classes so far this year. The first ended a few weeks ago. The second, we're about 2 or 3 weeks into it. Perhaps you're sitting here this morning and you wanted to go through Preface, but were unable to do so because one of the last 2 filled up. Well, now is your chance to get ahead of the curve. The next Preface is going to begin on Tuesday, April 7th. So you got about a month, almost a month from today. And you can go onto the app or onto our website, or you can talk to one of our wonderful in the back following the service to get your name on that list. Last call after the service, you have Preface-related questions or anything like that. But the only announcement that I really wanted to give you this morning about Preface is because I want to talk about one of our amazing partnerships that Watershed has throughout the city. One of my privileges here on staff is to help oversee and facilitate different partnerships with some amazing nonprofits here in Charlotte. And one of those nonprofits is HeartMath Tutoring. And I love our partnerships for a number of different reasons, and there are wonderful, wonderful things about all of them. But one of the things in particular I love about HeartMath is its accessibility. They make it incredibly your return is really, really good insofar as how much time it's going to cost you, but then the opportunity that you have to impact lives. And so, but rather than having me kind of ramble on about it, I want to invite Sydney Kramer and Sasha, who's one of our own Watersheds up. Sasha has been a HeartMath tutor for a little while now. We're going to let her tell you a little bit about what that looks like and what you could also look forward to if you were to sign up with HeartMath. So if you would welcome both of them up onto the stage with me.
Sasha, thank you so much for sharing your experience with Heart. This is Sasha's 3rd year as a tutor at Cotswold Elementary School, and would love to just start with what influenced you and motivated you to become a tutor.
So I've been at Watershed for a number of years, and I was looking for a way to give back. Someone was actually up here kind of doing a similar situation a couple years ago, and got involved. It only takes an hour of your time each week, and that's how it all started.
Is volunteering with Heart what you expected it to be?
Yes and no. Yes, the expectations are spelled out for you at orientation session, which usually starts at the beginning of every school year, or if you're a new tutor, just kind of a touch base. And then no, because I was really surprised and shocked with the relationships that I've built with not only my students, their families, other teachers, and other tutors as well.
So what does the actual tutoring look like during the school day?
So there is a designated area for tutoring. So you go in there, you're with other tutors and their students. There's a program coordinator. She walks around, or they walk around, I should say, using proper pronouns. We can walk around and answer any questions that you might have. I try to get there a little bit early just to see what my partner has, the other tutor has made notes for the last time that they were at session. Take a look, pull the binder. The curriculum is already spelled out for you from class, and then we get started.
What would you say to someone who's concerned about the math component of tutoring?
So math is a little bit different these days than when I was back in school, but it's trying to teach kids through fun hands-on experience, different ways to either count or different ways to look at groupings of numbers and that sort of thing. So there is the program coordinator that is there to answer any of your questions to make sure that you're confident going into it.
Great. So right now we have 7 weeks left of the program and 99 students who are in need of a second tutor, who are below grade level in math across elementary schools in Charlotte, needing those hands-on experiences and also the mentorship component. So if you are interested in learning how to get your feet wet this year and join for 30 minutes or an hour a week, you can go to our website, hearttutoring.org, or I will be hanging out in the back after the service to answer any questions. Thank you so much, Sasha.
Thank you.
So that is just one way to partner with and take ownership of what's going on here at Watershed. Another crucial way that we talk about and try to express our appreciation regarding every single week is to those of you who partner with and kind of take ownership of Watershed through your giving, through your material resources. We wouldn't be able to do the things that we do here. We wouldn't be able to kind of pursue the vision that we're articulating in this current Sunday morning series without your generosity. It's about $13,000 a week, to keep Watershed going. And that covers everything, including, and this is personal for me, including my opportunity and ability to make this my job and my vocation. And so even on a very deeply, deeply personal level, I thank you for your willingness to trust us with your resources and to partner with us in the mission that we have here at Watershed. Try to make it as accessible and simple as possible to give. You can do it through the app, through our website, or if you're old school, we have secure boxes in the back and near the front door. Thanks again for being here, and I will see you in just a couple minutes.
So again, we're in this series called Why Church? And we're kind of asking this question, why are we here? What does this matter? Why do we show up, when we've lost an hour of sleep and we're tired and we'd maybe rather be sleeping or have more coffee? And we're going to do a song that kind of speaks to a part of my story that has been part of my liberation. For much of my life, I've been kind of put in bubbles and places where I haven't been in conversations with people who are different than me. And I think that our society kind of does that to us in some ways. And then we kind of do that to ourselves. It's easier that way. And so this song speaks to a little bit of in other people. So this song's called A Better Bridge.
It's so hard to understand just where you're coming from. Try to see things from a different point of view. Trying not to pigeonhole or simply write you off. It's so much simpler if the parody is true. It's so easy to believe it's really you. I refuse to buy into this tired narrative that anyone who doesn't run with me is a fool. And I believe together we can build a better bridge. Spans the breadth of stars connecting me with you. Sick of towing party lines across the great divide. Sick of human hearts reduced to red or blue. Oftentimes my thoughts of you are cardboard cutout lies. So much simpler if the parody is true. It's so easy to believe it's really. I refuse to buy into this tired narrative that anyone who doesn't run with me is a fool. And I believe together we can build a better bridge. Spans the breadth of stars connecting me with you. And why is it so hard to just remember that you have a past to face, a harder day? Oh, it's so hard to just remember, yeah. We are less different than we are the same. I have to try. Yeah, I have to try. So I refuse to buy into this tired narrative that anyone who doesn't run with me is a fool. And I believe together we can build a better bridge. Spans the breadth of together we could build a better bridge that spans the breadth of stars, connecting me with you.
Here I am again. If you missed it, we're running a little late, which is understandable today. Even at this later service, it still is, at least it feels, an hour earlier. Or if you're just new here and have never seen me before, I'm David. I am the youth pastor, among other things here. Some of my youth are in the back. Hi, youth. Good to see you. I don't really see you. It's really bright, but I know you're there. I can feel your energy, so thank you for being here. About liberation this morning. But before I get to that, I want to tell you a story. Because like I said, there's a chance that some of you have never met me before, don't really know much of my background, how I ended up here. So just, somewhat abridged version. I'm in Charlotte by way of Arizona. If you've never been to Arizona, congratulations. Bit of a dismal state. But I went back in part because I was going on a retreat, and the retreat was lovely. Arizona that I appreciate, even if much of the rest of the place is a barren desert, both literally and kind of metaphorically. And so I had this opportunity to go back. And so the retreat was, kind of during the week. And so I tacked on a couple extra days just to see people. I'm a very sentimental person. I like driving around and kind of just reminiscing about, old places that I used to be a part of that were part of my life. So, drove around, wanted to see what changed and what was different. And I found myself experiencing this just like here, and I had to leave somewhat abruptly. I was let go, nicest way to put it, from a church that I worked at there for a little over 5 years because my conviction shifted when it came to LGBTQ affirmation and inclusion. That was hardly the only thing that they wanted to let me go over. Some of my earliest memories of being sent to the proverbial principal's office at that church involved agitation over their complete, not even indifference or ambivalence, their complete almost lack of awareness of a lot of what was going on and still going on when it comes to the unnecessary killings of Black people, mostly Black men, in this country at the hands of authorities and whatnot. Kind of the first sort of disruption I had there was just not even the fact that they didn't care about it, almost the fact that they didn't know about it. Or if they did know about it, it didn't occur to them to say anything. And so I was reflecting on that while I was there, and this week while I was preparing this talk that I'm having with you. And I realized that Gilbert, Arizona, which is a suburb of Phoenix, that's where I was, Gilbert, Arizona, almost exists in a sort of parallel reality, a kind of tangent universe separated off from the rest of society. Here's what I mean by that. A number of years ago, probably, last 5 years or so, a study came out showing that Gilbert, Arizona was the least poor city in the entire country. Now that might have shifted. Maybe they're number 3 or 2 or 4 or something now. But the point is, in Gilbert, Arizona, it's not the most affluent. There are richer cities, but it had the lowest percentage of people kind of per capita who are below whatever the kind of the federal poverty line is. You just don't see it there. And because you don't see it, you don't think about it. And so I realized that something had happened to me between my time there and now, and actually had begun to happen while I was there, but my eyes were becoming oriented to being able to see the world in a certain way, a way that I was blind to before. And once you kind of start going on that journey, you can't go back. You could go back physically, but you can't ever really go back. And so that was the dissonance, that was the disconnect I was experiencing there. We're in week 3 of this series, Here's the Church. And if you haven't been here so far, what this series basically is, it's an opportunity for Watershed to kind of express, articulate, and explore who we've become as a faith community over the last number of years. As of late, it's been pretty easy for us, and I think it's kind of our most comfortable way of articulating who we are as a church has been to say kind of what we're not or what we no longer are. Because it's pretty easy for us to kind of find some commonality and some common ground, even if what we're becoming is going off in various directions. There's at least a sense of solidarity or unity about what we are. But we felt kind of going into this year, and really kind of last year, as we were closing out last year and beginning to go into this year, we wanted to come up with a more positive and affirmative articulation of who we are collectively as a staff, our lead team and elders, and all of you. And so that's what this series is about. And last week, Scott talked about one of the values, what we're calling pathways, when it comes to naming that identity. He talked about this notion of reclamation, kind of the tension that we navigate when we're trying to be faithful to perhaps our faith or belief system of origin, while at the same time acknowledging the deep and necessary evolutions and shifts and changes that that many of us have undergone. And so what does it look like to almost reclaim or redeem some of that identity, but without bringing with us some of the harmful or abusive baggage that we were raised with? This week, we're going to talk about liberation, but before that, I actually want to go 2 weeks back. So if you weren't here for that week, Matt O'Neill kicked off this series, and he talked about something that we're calling a why statement or a mission statement. It's the reason for Watershed's existence. And like what you're going to see about liberation today, what you heard about reclamation last week, all of this is fluid. This is kind of the best we can do to articulate who we are today. It might look different a year from now. Because we together, all of us, and that includes you, are kind of ever in this process of evolution or transformation. But in that first week, Matt articulated this statement. It's going to be on the screen, and it says, Watershed is a community that is awakening. I put that is in there. Don't worry about that. Watershed is a community awakening, struggling, and loving together. Loving together as though a different world is possible today. That's why at least we think we exist, or at least that's what we're aspiring to when we're justifying or talking about the whyness of our existence. And there's a word in there that I want to focus on today because I think it animates our conversation this morning. That's the word struggle or struggling. Last week, Scott alluded to, kind of gestured towards the universality of struggle, but he only talked about it in the negative sense, and that's fine. That's, I think, often how we normally think about it. And I don't mean negative like qualitatively, like, oh, that's bad or good. I mean negative in more of a passive versus active sense. Struggle is something that we passively experience. It's imposed upon us. And even if we see that our struggle is maybe unique, there's my struggle and your struggle, their struggle and their struggle, it's something that, at least on some level, we universally experience. So there's a universality and a particularity, being the contrast, the individual element. There's a particularity, your struggle, my struggle, and a universality, our struggle, or at least the struggle that, or the reality that everyone experiences struggle. But then there's another way of conceiving of the meaning of struggle. It's interrelated with the negative, but it's more positive, more active. Struggling is something I choose to do. It's something that I enter into in resistance of perhaps maybe the negative struggle, whatever is being opposed upon me. I also struggle in resistance. Painful, it might still be difficult, but it's something that I'm opting into, that I'm leaning into. And that struggle can also be particular, individual, or it can be universal. In the universal sense, it passes into a category that I want to this morning call co-conspiracy. So just to kind of get some definitions on the board, on the metaphorical board, because I don't have a board, some definitions kind of out in the open before we go forward. I'm going to kind of pair together this idea of universality with this notion of co-conspiracy. And this idea of particularity, kind of mine and yours as opposed to ours, I'm going to more associate that with this notion of allyship. And these are going to kind of be the words that we're playing with when we talk about liberation. And here's what I mean by that. First off, I want to say that allyship is a good thing. It's a step forward. All of us walk into different social and political contexts with different degrees of power, often determined by our class, our identity, things like that. And in doing so, and coming to realize some of those power disparities, some of the material realities that those identities and those disparities kind of bring about, we have the opportunity to kind of step into a place of allyship. And allyship, the way I'm defining it today, it's acknowledging those particularities, being able to name and kind of see that within some of this radical difference, there is injustice. There are haves and have-nots, and oftentimes the have-not element is has a deep degree of focus around certain marginalized identities. Allyship names that. Allyship maybe even works on some level to resist that. But allyship kind of remains in this compartmentalized space of particularity, of individuality. It is your struggle. It is their struggle. And we might be sympathetic to that. We might have compassion towards it. We might even, in our best moments, engage in some sort of reparative step, materially, relationally, or otherwise. And that is all good. So don't hear what I'm not saying this morning. Allyship is a huge step up from, at least, and I'll just speak for myself, at least where I was, I know, when I lived in Gilbert, Arizona for 9 years and found myself similarly oblivious to what was really going on around me at kind of the material level. The other thing I want to clarify, when I say material, I'm contrasting it from just spiritual. Oftentimes, when we're a place like this, a spiritual community, a church, we leave the conversation kind of purely in this spiritual realm. And that, don't get me wrong, I don't want to minimize the importance of spirituality, but if the church can't also speak into material realities, the political injustices, the policy injustices, the way that what we believe often has a direct effect on our access to the things that we need to live, well, then I think the church, watershed or otherwise, is sort of abdicating its mission. At least we believe that. It's a step up from ambivalence or ignorance. It's even a step up from, an awareness that kind of leads to a certain, maybe well-meaning, but ultimately ineffective attempt to sort of like will ourselves past the sort of disparities I'm talking about. I'm going to give some specific examples in a few minutes that, are going to maybe look at racism and race and so allyship is better than perhaps being colorblind and just kind of assuming that, we are in some sort of like post-racial, and that you could fill in any form of supremacy culture. It doesn't have to be white supremacy. You could fill in patriarchy, heteronormativity, ableism, so first and foremost, hear that allyship is progress. It's a step forward. But as we talk about liberation collectively as a community, I want to suggest to you that there are additional steps, and that this move into co-conspiracy kind of crosses this threshold into an ever greater collective or universality when it comes to our attempts at liberation. And to illustrate this, there's a passage in the Bible I want to look at. It's in the book of Exodus. And if you are like uber newbie to church, Exodus is the one about Moses. Maybe you see Prince of Egypt, great soundtrack. Or maybe you're kind of more old school, more of a Charlton Heston person. Or maybe you're a sadist and saw that new one with Christian Bale that came out a few years ago. That one was pretty mediocre. I'm told, I didn't see it. I'm just kind of going by. My cousin is a movie critic. He said don't see it. So, but if you're not familiar, just by way of a bridge catch-up, Moses was an Israelite who was living in Egypt because the Egyptians had enslaved the people of Israel. And it had been going on for a couple hundred years, about 400 years. And kind of by some sort of providential or serendipitous circumstances, Moses comes to be a prince of Egypt. Hence the title of the movie, Prince of Egypt. And he becomes aware, he kind of develops this sort of dual consciousness. He becomes aware of his, his birthright as a Hebrew, as a person of Israel, but while also kind of living in this deep privilege. He begins to enter into this consciousness of allyship. He tries to do something about it. It goes really badly. He runs away for a while. There's this weird psychedelic experience with a burning bush. He ends up coming back. There's lots of plagues. This is probably the part most of you are familiar with. And finally, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, relents and decides to let Moses' people go. We're all caught up? Brilliant. So they are leaving Egypt to go to the promised land that that God had promised them back in Israel. And that's where we pick up our story in Exodus chapter 12. It says, now the Israelites had done as Moses told them, and they gave them whatever they wanted. And so they plundered Egypt. Pause there. I think, at least for me, for the purposes of what I'm trying to do this morning, I can associate this first verse with the notion of allyship. This is the Egyptians still seeing themselves as separate. Some of them might have even come to sympathize with the Israelites. They can acknowledge their suffering, your suffering over there. And some of them, whether by guilt, shame, or genuine compassion or altruism were led, it says by God, but on some level were led to make reparations. That's good. This is good. I don't want to minimize what some of these Egyptians were doing here, by attempting to material is important, materially repair the relationship with the Israelites. But what makes me really, really excited is what happens next. The Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth. That's not the part that excites me. There were about 600,000 men on foot plus their dependents. And also went up with them, and flogged a very large number of cattle. That might be my favorite verse in the whole Bible. If I were to get tattooed like on me, no offense if that's you, I'm not going to do that, but I would probably cut it off before the cattle part. But nevertheless, this is a deeply, deeply meaningful passage of scripture for me, because this was the passage that kind of began my own. Mixed multitude also went up with them. That means Egyptians also went up with them. That means for at least a handful, for a small amount, for a number of these Egyptians, they felt, whether, however they would articulate it, the interruption, the call of God, their own conscience, whatever happened, something shifted so that mere allyship, mere, kind of a mere us, them, mine, yours experience of struggle and reparation was not enough. On some level, they came to understand that their own liberation, we don't know who this was. We don't know if they were, rich, wealthy, privileged Egyptians, or kind of more working class Egyptians. It says mixed. I'm going to go with both. But on some level, all of them realized that their liberation is inextricably bound with the liberation of the most marginalized among themselves. And they did what they had no choice to do. They went out with them. They baked cakes and bread without yeast, using the dough that they had brought from Egypt, for it was made without yeast. Because, and I almost didn't include this verse, but I wanted to, because it captures the urgency. Because they were thrust out of Egypt and were not able to delay. They could not prepare food for themselves either. Oftentimes, the journey towards allyship is a journey. It's just that. My wife and I talk about the difference between, being able to shift, by flipping a switch or by turning a dial. And there are certain times in our lives when a switch flips. Other times it's a dial. For me, my own experience towards allyship was a dial. It was a slow turn over a number of years. Something happens and you can't go back. And it might cost you something. In fact, I would count on it. But everything is different. And so my encouragement this morning, my desire for us is that, as we continue along this road, for many of us, often for me in many contexts, towards allyship, we don't see that as like the final destination, but rather it's more of a receding horizon, something that we're kind of chasing, knowing that we can't quite get there. And somewhere in the process, that allyship, it transforms, it evolves into something more universal. Something that I'm calling, and I didn't come up with this terminology, I got it from Cedric Lundy and Sean Bowers-Buxton, two of our other teaching pastors, something that I'm calling co-conspiracy. Here's a practical example. I mentioned earlier that I was going to use racism and race as an example. Probably maybe the most prominent verbiage, when it comes to the challenge of white supremacy and racism that we have, in our contemporary cultural moments is the slogan or the name or the organization Black Lives Matter. And of course, if you're familiar with Black Lives Matter, you are probably also familiar with the counter rhetoric, all lives matter. And I get the confusion about this because at first blush, when you're hearing all, you think, okay, all is the universal one, and we want universality. We want, equality, liberty. Those should be universal values. And so I get it, sort of, but paradoxically, or kind of ironically speaking, I want to argue that is actually the notion, the value, the inspiration behind the idea of Black Lives Matter. That's actually the universal. Here's how this works. It's kind of a common desire or kind of motivation amongst whatever we are, kind of progressive, inclusive, spiritual types, that we're trying to avoid binaries. We're trying to avoid dualisms. We're trying to avoid kind of either or, if then kind of statements. And often what that leads us to do, maybe with good intention, but what that leads us to do is try to avoid any appearance of extremism or radicality. kind of thinking that there's some sort of third way that's maybe more unifying or inclusive. But what I think is lost in that is if you think about it, kind of going a moderate or transcendent, more central position, it actually just takes that binary for granted. It assumes that there are these, kind of two extreme sides that are unable to be reconciled in any way, and it sort of just opts out. Kind of that third way approach is akin to what I was talking about earlier, that notion of color blindness, kind of saying, well, we know, and we know of this firm conviction, false as it may be, that there are genuine biological differences between what we have designated in our modern society as race. And there's not. And so this transcendent third way might say something like, well, we know that there's no real, thing of race. It's a social construct. And so let's just kind of pretend that, let's just will ourselves into a post-racial society. Maybe they're well-meaning, maybe they're not. I don't know. I'm not going to pass judgment on the intentions, but the reality of what that does is it ignores and it erases the material and historical realities that the construct of race has wrought and continues to rot on our society. And we can't just discard those things. Allyship takes the step forward. It acknowledges that their existence, but allyship almost lets us particular. It says that is your suffering, that is your marginalization, and in a good way, it seeks to reconcile or repair that. But it reinforces the radical difference in an irreconcilable way. The universality of co-conspiracy, just like with the Egyptians that we saw that stood and entered and left and divested of themselves, divested of a part of their identity in solidarity with the people of Israel, sees that no, my liberation is in fact bound up in yours. And in fact, it is not only is it bound up, but it is precisely at the site of your liberation. At the site of the liberation of the most marginalized, the most downtrodden. This is where, if you're familiar with it, the notion of intersectionality becomes incredibly, incredibly spiritually as well as materially relevant to this conversation. But it's at the point of liberation of the most marginalized that I too find my liberation. And we can understand this spiritually. I'm going to get to that in a moment, but we can even see this historically. Cedric Lundy, who I mentioned earlier, he talks about this all the time. When he shares with us, he talks about the fact that historically speaking in this country, the notion of race was literally invented to uphold the practice of racism. See, we often think it's the other way around. We think that, we take for granted race. History tells us it's exactly the opposite. There was a need, there was a power dynamic, there was a class divide that needed to be maintained. You see, we had these wealthy landowners and captors who they had African slaves, but they were also employing a great number of like Irish and Italian and other European descended peoples as indentured servants and even occasionally slaves as well. And what was happening is almost, think about with me. I know it's been a long time, but think about a bug's life. They were beginning to realize that, wait a second, there are way more of us than there are of you. And they were beginning to organize. They were beginning to tap into the universality of their struggle. And the owners, they couldn't have that. And so they began to create laws. They began to create policies, racist laws and racist policies that created and reinforced this construct of race, offering token amounts of privilege to those of European ancestry, and in doing so, dividing them against their shared struggle and their common interests. The most famous probably example of this centered around Bacon's Rebellion. You can go Google that later. And there's some problematic things about that. But this is what we see historically. We see that there's this tension. There's this tension between the narratives that we receive, and the history that inform them, and then the reality or the world we're trying to create. So with all of that groundwork laid, I want to look at Watershed's working definition of liberation. And I say it's our working definition because all of this is fluid. All of this is in flux. I mean, I actually wrote what you're about to see on the screen in concert with our staff and our lead team and many of our block leaders and otherwise. And I would actually, there's even a few things that I probably tweak today, and there's a good chance this will look different, hopefully more precise, more inclusive, more universal in the future. But hopefully you'll see elements of what I've already been talking about this morning. Liberation means living in the world as it actually is. That's owning the material realities, the histories around our various identities and around our policies and our politics. Living in the world as it actually is, but loving as if we believe a different world is possible. Not pretending it's already here, but loving as if it's possible. In living in the world as it is, we prioritize the truth lived on the margins because it's often the powerful who tell the stories of history. This is what I'm getting at when I say that, at least when it comes to racism, leaning into the truth and the necessity of Black lives mattering and that acknowledgement and fighting for the policies that acknowledge that is actually the side of universal liberation. Because it unmasks the ways that whiteness and white supremacy, to use the race-related example, are also limiting me. They're also they're material, limiting me. They're dividing me against my brothers and my sisters. But they're also existentially, spiritually, holding me back from what it means to be authentically free, authentically human. So we prioritize the truth lived on the margins because too often it's the powerful who tell the stories of history. By loving as if we believe a different world is possible, there's a tension here. We differentiate between the unjust and dehumanizing narratives like whiteness, like patriarchy, like heteronormativity, that enslave and the people who hold them. This isn't who you are. I see in leadership of those on the margins who have been struggling for liberation for centuries, whose lament informs our humility and whose joyful resistance in the face of injustice animates our hope. There's a tension here, a sort of contradiction. And I'll just speak for myself, and I'll continue to use race and racism as the example. I am simultaneously white and not white. And it's got to be both and. It can't be either or. I have to own my whiteness. I have to own my complicity and my benefit and my privilege within the narrative of whiteness that was created and continues to be perpetuated, not only, though especially, to marginalized people of color, but also is used as a tool to keep people who look like me in line. So there's a liberation in owning my own benefit from and complicity in that narrative. But there's also a reality, as Ibn Kendi and others talk about, that this is a fiction. And though it is still a material and historical reality, I create a sense of separation between the inevitability of that narrative and my own. Moved past all of this and just, kind of living in willful ignorance at the struggle and the anxiety and the reality that so many of us continue to experience. I push past the temptation of going back to Gilbert, Arizona. But at the same time, I also resist the pitfall of allyship that continues to see that these disparities are at least based on something essential, something real or genuine, that there is truly a gap between us at the level of being, in which, at least on some level, risks keeping me from embracing full, genuine, authentic, and holistic solidarity with the most marginalized among us. And so that's the tension of liberation, kind of this dueling consciousness that we have to hold both of them firmly, clearly, boldly, as we collectively co-conspire, universally struggling for liberation that first and foremost is found and born at the side of the most oppressed, but then overflows into the liberation of all. If I'm new for you, if I'm not new for you, in fact, if you've heard me preach before, you're probably wondering where the fantasy or sci-fi references are going to pop in. Your wait is over. It's now. Many of you know I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan. An issue in that fandom is the fact that Peter Jackson went on to make 3 more Middle-earth related movies, the Hobbit trilogy, much less good. But, and if Bob Gregory is in here, cover your ears, Bob, I'm going to say something nice about The Hobbit. There are moments, glimpses of some, meaningful, at least for me, kind of moving ideas. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, I'm about to talk about wizards and dwarves, so just kind of prepare yourself. But there's a scene where Bilbo Baggins, the Hobbit that the title is based upon, Bilbo Baggins it's near the end of don't you want to go back to your home? I thought you went back to the comforts of the Shire. When you think Shire, Gilbert, Arizona. And Bilbo says, look, I have a home. And I have thought about it, and I do miss it. But you don't have a home. It was taken from you. And I'm committed to helping you reclaim it. To be honest, in this moment, Bilbo is kind of crossing into the threshold of allyship. He's kind of beginning this journey. And over the course of the next 2 movies, because they decided to make it, never mind. Over the course of the next 2 movies, at some point I believe that allyship enters into more of a universal, more of a co-conspirator posture. And it harkens back to something that Gandalf, the wizard I told you about, mentioned to him earlier on in the journey, because Bilbo says, will I come back? Can you promise me that I'll come back? Gandalf says, no, I can't promise you that. And further, if you do, you'll never be the same. And, for those of you who know the story, if not, spoiler alert, Bilbo does go back, and yeah, he goes back to his old life, but he isn't ever the same. He's been changed. He can't unsee what he saw. He can't undo the changes that happened both within him and that he witnessed outside of himself. In a sense, he was placed outside of himself. He was made radically vulnerable in what he was leaning on for his security, for his identity. And in that radical vulnerability, he was liberated. He was set free to be in a posture of genuine solidarity with the other. In this case, the dwarves, but other people too. And isn't that how the cross works? Isn't that how liberation is tied into our notion of salvation? On the cross, God expresses God's self in radical solidarity with the most marginalized, beaten and brutalized, stripped naked, hung from a tree, outside the city gates, in a position of maximum dishonor. And yet it's in that moment, that sort of interruption also, in a weirdly universal way, also interrupts us. The cross, in the same way, strips us of our own attempts to secure ourselves based on identity, vocation, ability, affluence. It leaves us vulnerable. And paradoxically, though, that vulnerability is in fact our salvation. Because paradoxically speaking, we are then set free to stand in solidarity with the other, not just any other, all others, but especially the most marginalized among us. The scales fall from our eyes, and we are made to realize that, in fact, our salvation, our liberation, is inextricably bound with theirs. And it is only particularly and precisely at the site of their liberation that we, too, experience our own. Their struggle becomes our struggle. Your struggle becomes my struggle. And going forward, it's our struggle. Grace and peace to you this morning. Thank you.
Would you stand? Let's close this morning by singing together. You make me brave. You make me brave. You call me out beyond the shore into the waves. You make me brave. You make me brave. No fear can hinder now of the made away. You make me brave. You make me brave. You call me out beyond the shore into the waves. You make me brave. You make me brave. No fear can hinder now the promises you made. You unravel me with a melody. You surround me with a song of deliverance from my enemies, till all my fears are gone. And I'm no longer a slave to fear. Oh, I am a child of God.
greatness of you now. I've heard of the majesty and wonder of you, King of heaven, humility and pride. And your love, wave after wave, crashes over me, crashes over me. You are for us, you are not against us. Champion of heaven, made a way for all to enter. And you make me brave, you make me brave. You call me out beyond the shore into the wave. You make me brave, you make me brave. No fear can hinder now the love that made a way. You make me brave, you make me brave. You call me out beyond the shore into the waves. You make me brave, you make me brave. No fear can end me now, promises you made. You make me brave, you make me brave. You call me out beyond the shore into the waves. You make me brave, you make me brave. No fear can end me now, the Lord that made a way. And I am surrounded by songs of deliverance. We've been liberated from our bondage of fear. We're the sons and the daughters. Let us sing our song of freedom. You split the sea so I could walk right through it. You drowned my fears in perfect love. You rescued me so I could stand and sing. I am right through it. You drowned my fears in perfect love. You rescued me so I could stand and sing. I am a child of God. I am a child of God. Oh, I am a child of God. Oh, I am the child of God. Thank you so much for being here this morning, for singing with us. It is our prayer. And we walk out these doors that the liberation that we see in ourselves, that we see around us, is not clouded by fear, that we can walk into this week being brave and being in a space where we aren't hindered by our fear. So thank you so much for being here. We hope you'll join us next week. Have a great Sunday, and we'll see you next week for the last week of this series.
To make you its possession.